In this episode, we answer your questions. We talk about fueling, how to fuel a Gran Fondo, calorie calculations, and more novel endurance sports such as Race Across America, race walking, and Hyrox events. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Nduranz Podcast with myself, Alex Rhodes, and Dr. Tim Podlogar. How are we doing today, Tim?
Hey, Alex. I'm doing well. Let's say well. Be polite, although I'm a bit tired of everything and I need a holiday. We are recording this a few weeks before Christmas time, and I wish actually it was already Christmas because then I would be enjoying the holiday.
Yeah, it can always get super busy in all walks of life, leading up to Christmas and trying to get things done at work and prepare to go away as well. Where is there any particular place you're heading over the Christmas period?
Well, I go home, let's call it home, to Slovenia twice a year, so once in the summer and once in the winter. But when I say I go home, it always means that I go into the car pretty much the first thing and drive to Dolomites or somewhere in Austria or some mountains. So yes, I'm going cross-country skiing and alpine skiing or whatever I'll be doing there without a bike.
So for the listeners, if you haven't been and listened to our latest podcast on altitude training, go listen to that because it was a great and fascinating episode that we spoke about. But I was going to ask you then, Tim, are you taking any tips from there for going up into the mountains and enjoying that skiing a bit more, or are you just going to acclimatize while you're up there?
Well, even if I had a altitude chamber here in Exeter, I wouldn't be able to really utilize it because just training at altitude is not really helpful, as we found out. So here we go.
Well, we'll let the listeners go and we won't give too much information away. They can go and listen to that. But we're going to do a new kind of podcast where it's still me and you talking, but we're doing a Q&A session today. So the listeners have sent in their questions, and we're going to attempt to answer them. There's some real interesting questions there, and I hope it's going to open up some information for you, a conversation that might explore that particular topic. But just before we go there, because it's a new episode, do we know anything that's new in the world of sports science or research at the minute, Tim?
Not really. Everything is still as it was on the 1st of January. On the 1st of January, we will know who is sponsoring which team, and we will know these details. But until then, we just need to not reveal any information.
Yeah, there's some super exciting things going on in the cycling world over the next month, and like you say, some exciting things coming ahead. Seeing what teams are changing names, who's sponsoring what teams, but also this is a time where riders are moving teams, and we're seeing some of that in the media at the minute. So I suppose while the sport dies down, there's some exciting kind of transfers and things going on over this period. So maybe let's get into our questions and start with our first question and see where that takes us. So we've thank you to all the viewers that sent questions in. We've tried to kind of categorize some of these so that we keep them on topic and we can answer as much of that specific thing as possible, and then we can move on to a separate one. So really what we're going to start on, there's quite a lot of questions on fueling. So the first question one of the first questions that we had was how to fuel easy rides to perform better for harder training later in the week. So what's your first take on that, Tim?
Well, we first need to define why we are doing these easy rides. Is it easy to basically recover, which is what professionals are doing, or whoever, like just going to not have a rest day, but just going for a little spin? Or you're actually considering this a training session, just it happens to be of low intensity. And the reason why I kind of go into that is that if you want to recover as quickly as possible, but just to spin the legs, then it makes sense that this training session is kind of well supported with carbohydrates even during. So I would definitely go with some carbohydrates, especially in the last 30 minutes of the session, because this way you basically prevent any kind of like big decline in liver glycogen stores and speed up the recovery after. And you really don't want to like stress the body even more. You're just doing this session for the sake of doing it. And then if you are doing actually a training session, this is part of your, I don't know, let's call it zone 2 training, then perhaps you don't really want to have that many carbohydrates. So I would probably go without carbohydrates during a 90 minutes or less. Anything more, I would probably start with some more carbohydrates, but it really depends. But then the next question would be then also if the next day you're actually performing a hard training session or a hard race, then these 90 minutes, I would still fuel it, because then in the last 30 minutes or 1 hour, the carbohydrates you're eating would actually be used for glycogen replenishment after exercise. So again, makes sense to basically preload or start carbohydrates with a carbohydrate intake before the end of the ride already. So it's really context dependent.
And I think I see that answer a lot in the application of, I say, sports science in general, is it does depend. It depends on some of that context. But it's interesting you came across that that point there, that often we perhaps want to think about, are we training for adaptation? You know, where are we in that training cycle versus are we training, like you say, for recovery so that we perform either a race, you know? So there's differences there of gaining accumulative fatigue and trying to push those adaptive responses versus I want to be fresh so that I'm going to race and I want to be fully fueled at that point. So there's an interesting dynamic that it could be either of those.
Yeah.
And I think something else as well is considerations that I see certainly with athletes that we work with is what those easy rides consist of in a sense of, are we trying to recover? So really, are they easy, or, are we going out and riding with a group and it's a bit harder? And if those cases prevail, please correct me on this, Tim. But if it does end up being a bit harder, then it's more likely that we are going to want to fuel a little bit, even if it was supposedly easy at the time.
Yeah, like I always have something in the pockets, whatever it is. Like you want to be ready for having carbohydrates, even if it's an easy session, especially if you go outdoors and you can't really stop.
Like the days when you think, easy group ride, we're going to go out, and somebody just decides to put the hammer down, and and you're chasing, and you need something as a backup. So I know that kind of answered the question, but there's those two instances there. So hopefully that listener can take that away and understand the context of their training and what they might want to do for that. Next question. So fueling for a Gran Fondo. So the listener has asked, should I start fueling carbs right from the beginning? Let's say first 15 minutes and go with a high intake such as 90 grams an hour? Or should I try to utilize or not suppress fat oxidation in those early parts and start moderately fueling around 35, 40 minutes into the race and progressively increase as we go along? Did that make sense?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And like going back to doing my own Gran Fondos, I always think how I fueled and what strategy I took. And actually thinking about it now, I feel like I always started with a high carbohydrate intake before already. So like I took a gel before the start, and in the first after half an hour, I already had the first gel to basically get to 90 grams per hour. And thinking like on the latest evidence, I kind of feel like this makes a lot of sense, because even though you feel like, oh, it's a 4 hour, 5 hour, 6 hour, 7 hour long ride, at the end of the day, it's actually that at the start, everyone really pushes hard because you need to position yourself and try to stay with your group, and everyone is fresh and just goes way too hard than what like you're supposed to go. So you need to, even though you wanted to go to make it easy in the first bit, you actually push pretty hard. And also because of all the positioning and like you're still riding in a big group of people, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a really clear strategy to start fueling from the start, because later in the race it will definitely probably happen that you might miss one gel, lose one gel, not get a bottle where you wanted to get a bottle, don't stop on a stop when you wanted to stop on a feeding zone, or something will happen. So I think from my perspective, I think it kind of makes sense to start fueling from the start. And I would definitely take the other strategy if I was doing a long endurance ride to progressively increase the intake. But when it comes to a Gran Fondo, I would start from the start and try to equally distribute the carbohydrate intake.
So I was going to bring up that point there, that it does raise the question of how that is going to start. Like, is, you know, from the rider perspective, is it a case of I'm doing this and I'm going to pace it nice and steady and I just want to complete this? You know, we call them spotties over in the UK. Or, as we know, you know, the front end of Gran Fondos can be pretty hard racing and it can go hard from the start. And that, you know, the substrate utilization is going to dramatically change how that does start, and as you progress further on into that race as well. So again, there's a bit of context there that you were able to disseminate and say, well, actually, they do start pretty hard, and therefore we might want to start fueling early. Whereas, you know, as we go out for long training rides, we might want to progress that because we're a bit more in control of the intensity.
I feel like you don't do Gran Fondo every week, you know, like you do it like once a month at most or once a year even. So it's kind of like you probably can just fuel well for that day and don't like think about the energy expenditure and the energy balance and these things. Just go with the high carbohydrate intake, and I can say that probably like, yeah, in theory, like going super high with carbohydrates can to a certain degree like increase, I don't know, use of muscle glycogen if you overdo it, but just don't overdo it. Just go with like normal amounts, like 90 grams per hour, or and it should be fine. Like there is no harm in doing that, and yeah, like it can only be beneficial even for recovery after this session. So I would definitely not be thinking, oh, no, let's progressively increase the intake. Perhaps, yeah, like if you like start with 90 grams per hour and for the last 2 hours of an 8 hour long Gran Fondo, when you're going super fast and like you still have the capacity to go with like, I don't know, 120 or something, then you can increase even more, but definitely don't go below and like think, oh, I will increase fat oxidation rates now. No, like this doesn't make any sense.
But we also forgetting and how that's done as well. And you know, if you're taking this in doses and you take the first, you know, dose, which is a quarter of that in the first 15 minutes, you know, it takes time for this to go through the digestive system and ultimately get to the muscle.
Oh yeah.
And therefore, you know, actually it's not happening right there in the first 15 minutes. You know, it might actually happen much further down. It's not like we're taking 90 grams on the 15 minutes and everything's going to go wild. It takes a bit to get through the system.
Well, it needs like 90 minutes to get peak oxidation rate. So this means that it needs 90 minutes before you actually see like very high utilization of ingested carbohydrates. So you're not like fueling for that particular moment, you're actually fueling in advance. And in 90 minutes, you will probably be in the middle of the big climb somewhere. So you will need those carbs then.
Yeah, cool. Right, next question. My goal is to break the 3-hour barrier in a marathon. I plan to use 90 grams of endurance per hour, a total of 270 grams over the entire race. I'll train my gut beforehand, and I will use 3 by 250 ml bottles with the energy unit drink, and I'll also use 3 gels. My plan is half a gel every 6 kilometers and half before the start. Is this too much? Should I take half a gel every 7 kilometers and use only 2.5 gels? I know there's a bit of maths there, and I'm reading it off the screen, but let me know if it didn't.
Yeah, running is a tough one. Like, and there is like a mixed bag of evidence whether like what amount of carbohydrates would actually improve performance, especially when you're talking about not super long durations. But for 3 hours, I would definitely say that like the evidence is pretty clear. Probably like 80 to 90 grams per hour is what is best for performance. So if the gut is basically able to take up this amount of, or tolerate this amount of carbohydrates, I would definitely go for it. And then how the distribution and everything, like it's just like down to the personal preferences and also the weather. Because if it's hot, then you want to like kind of have more liquids and less concentrated forms of carbohydrates. If it's relatively cool, then concentrated carbs make more sense, but definitely try it out. And also like make sure that you can sustain the pace and the ingestion rate of carbohydrates, because otherwise, and also like additional stress of the competition might actually like make you eat less. You're more likely to get GI issues, and so it's a really tough one. But definitely like thinking about 80 to 100 grams per hour would make sense. How it depends, and make sure you practice that, and you can practice even with slightly more carbohydrates, and on the day you're really confident that you can get in the 90 grams per hour.
Yeah, I think from my perspective as well on that is very much about the logistics around how you do that. And this listener mentioned he uses 3 by 250 ml, which is some of that carbohydrate source. And experience of working with marathon runners is that it's quite variable in gastric distress, especially having liquids and the oscillation of running, which can cause problems. So long as you've practiced and you know at race pace and race environment, you can consume that. You know where you're going to get that on the course, because if it's, like a major marathon, like, Paris or London or Berlin, how are you going to access that 250 ml? And like you also mentioned there, Tim, what's the weather? So if it is cold or it's too hot, you might end up wanting a bit more fluid or a little bit less fluid. So kind of segregating your carbohydrate intake to your fluid. I know it's something that you've spoke about in the past.
Yeah, it's a really tough one without knowing the specifics. Like, it's about like the best advice I can give is really to try it out and see what actually works, because usually like the idea people have is actually a pretty good one, because I see like the person knows the products, knows like initial plans, so just try it out and see. But the amount of like carbs this person is trying to kind of get in like makes sense. So it's just about making sure that it's achievable.
Yeah, the application.
Yeah.
Right, we've got a question which is very close to your heart now, Tim. Just to round off this fueling section, what is, if any, the magical power of Haribo?
It's secret. Like we can't
apart
talk.
from the magic is actually because it's the main factory is in the north of the UK, and certainly for the UK distribution. And the north is the best.
That's
place.
why the UK ones are so bad. Because they're made in the UK.
So what's the magic behind Haribo?
Well, that's a secret. We can't disclose that. No, kidding aside. Basically, the magic is that it's a sweet thing. And when we talk about sweets, or like, when we talk about sweets, like in the country we come from Slovenia, we throw everything from chocolate to cakes and like Haribos in the same bag. And then people and mothers and everyone would be like, yeah, it's the same, it's a sweet thing. You shouldn't be eating this, but in reality is that like Haribo are in certain scenarios really good because they have zero fat. And this makes them great. Like a lot of carbohydrates, zero fat and zero fiber. That's it. You could get the same amount with different products. Or like, just eating normal food, perhaps rice or pasta, for instance, but this is just convenient, and there is nothing really secret about them.
Or even the likes of gels, it's sugar, zero fat, zero fiber.
That's like for during exercise, I think like Haribo are a bit worse because we have no idea about the ratio of carbohydrates. So we don't know about glucose to fructose ratio. We don't know about the, or like there is no sodium, there is no electrolytes in there. So it's not probably the best. And there are better products out there, but
And logistically difficult to carry and take if you're riding, you kind of want to access a gel super quick and know what you're getting. Whereas it's okay if you're on a training ride, but if you want to know what to fuel with, it's easy just to get out rather than trying to open a bag while you're on the bike. And gels are well, that's why they've become what they've become, isn't it? Because they're practical.
Yeah, exactly.
So moving on to our next topic, which is around calorie consumption, but we've still got Haribo in this next question. So what types of food or meals should I be eating as an amateur rider to ensure adequate energy intake each day in terms of muscle and liver glycogen replenishment, apart from Haribo?
Well, it's normal food. Like this is what athletes are eating, and it's just like getting enough pasta, enough rice, and enough carbohydrates in general. I feel like we need to focus on liver glycogen when we're going into the extremes, and like we're dealing with like really long rides without any carbohydrate ingestion or very low. Professionals going out for 6 hours and only having like 40 grams an hour, definitely liver will be empty after, so we want to replenish it. But for normal people like me and you and that are training, I don't know, up to 15 hours a week, I don't think like paying that much attention to this is like essential. But I like to think about it having some sweet stuff like a juice in the morning, or some like syrup in the syrup or honey or jam in the morning, and then just after a training session makes kind of a lot of sense to have like simple carbs. But then for the rest of the day, like lunch and dinner, I would definitely go with normal carbs and don't try to get the sugars in, because like we know that the energy requirements are not so great that we would probably emphasize the intake of like massive amount of fast carbs, unless we're doing glycogen loading for the next day.
Yeah, and I think certainly the avenue that nutrition in endurance sport is going is that we are considering the training sessions that we are having as well. And it's probably right to say that we'll maybe dictate on that, on what or how much we are consuming on that day. So if it's going to be pretty long or pretty intense, then we want to take a bit more on. And if it's not, or we're on a rest day, we can focus on a bit of quality and getting, you know, fruits and vegetables and the likes in at that time.
Yeah, of course. Like, I mean, I like to look at it from what is coming the next day. So if today is my rest day and tomorrow I have doing a really hard one, then I would perhaps eat a bag of Haribo already today. But just for the sake of eating a bag of Haribo.
It's dangerous. I just put intensity every day, just so that I can do that. Right, how reliable? This is quite a good one, actually. How reliable is calorie consumption on Garmin or Wahoo devices? How do they calculate this, and can I trust them, especially from the weight loss perspective? So how do I include them in my daily nutrition plan, which is based on weighing food and counting calories? For context, I'm a road cyclist with 20 years experience and over 10,000 kilometers per year.
It's an inconvenient
It's a good one. It's a tough one, though.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And like, as a nutritionist, you know, like when I do podcasts or like interviews about my work in the professional cycling, I will say, yeah, like we calculate everything very precisely up to the gram, because we have these power meters and we can very accurately determine the energy use on the bike and outside the bike, and we can get like up to a certain each calorie. And in a way, this is just like me pretending that I know stuff and others don't, but the actual reality is that, well, things are not as they seem to be, because I was just before this podcast, I actually went out and like did some calculations to basically be able to demonstrate this point, which I've done quite a few times and I always come to the same conclusion, which we'll come to later. But basically, let's say that we have a power meter during the training session. We assume that power meter is actually displaying the correct values, which very often it isn't. So we have an error of plus minus 1%, at least plus minus 1%. And then if we now try to convert this into energy expenditure, and this is what Garmin, Wahoo, Strava, and all those apps are doing, what you need to then do is basically assume a certain factor of efficiency. So we know that when we exercise, not all of the energy we turn over goes into the mechanical work. A lot of goes into the heat. So when we measure power and then calculate the amount of work we produce in an hour or do in an hour with the parameters, then we need to figure out what is the heat production basically. And the heat production can be anything between 80 probably and 75%. So we get to efficiency of 20 to 25%. Okay. So I said to ChatGPT, because it was the easiest thing to do, and I tried the calculations because I would get to the same conclusion. And I asked him, let's say that during a training session, I do 3,500 kilojoules of work, which is kind of a long training session for a relatively highly trained person. How many kilocalories would I expend if my efficiency was 20, 23, and 25%? So usually what I think Garmin would probably do, and I'm not sure about others, but usually they just assume that 3,500 kilojoules equals 3,500 kilocalories. And this comes out from the fact that if you do all these conversions, this would be efficiency of 24%. And this is what we nutritionists usually use when we calculate things, because it's the easier thing, because it's just like equals, just you change the units. But there is some more maths behind it, but it just happens to be the same. But anyway, so for 20% efficiency, for 3,500 kilojoules of work, we get 4,182 kilocalories. and that for 25% efficiency, we only get 3,346 calories. So we get a difference of almost 800 kilocalories.
It's quite a lot.
What's the efficiency of each individual? Well, it can be anything between 20 and 24% or 25%, and I've seen both in the lab. And you can measure this in the lab, but now use these numbers outside when the bike is not stable, like straight, but is actually moving side to side. And probably this will change again. And it will probably change when you do an effort, or you go just easy pace, or when you're fatigued and non-fatigued. So pretty much it's a guesswork. And this is just the start, because then what about the rest of the day? How much do you actually expend the rest of the day? How much does the recovery take? I have no idea. I can use some equations that are out there in the literature. They're all very inaccurate and just very crude predictions. I can also even go and do the doubly labeled water method, which some studies claim to have done, and came up with some numbers. And I can say that even that method is completely flawed if you don't know certain metabolism parameters that they don't know. So basically, the answer is we have absolutely no idea how accurate they are, which is more accurate than the other. And working with athletes, I found out that I need to use different ways of calculating the numbers to basically maintain the energy balance, because the one equation or one way of doing it would make someone gain weight, and the same way would make someone completely and every day being hungry. So it's a lot of guesswork, and yeah, here we go. And can I add one more point? Yes. Yeah, I will go on.
Point as well, but go on, you first.
If you think that the labels on the nutritional labels on the food is accurate, then you're completely wrong, because it isn't. Sports nutrition product, that's probably the most accurate you can get, because it's very easy to measure 20 grams or 40 grams of carbohydrates. But when you have bread and a composite of different types of carbohydrates, you will get lost. And usually you will even very rarely weigh raw food. You will usually weigh cooked food, and then the complexity goes even to higher proportions. So basically, we're just doing guesswork and pretending that we know it all. We don't.
That was thank you for that. You beat me to my last point there. That around there was actually, I don't know if it was a study or just a review, where they actually took items off the shelf of the supermarket and looked at their values, or the nutritional values on the back. And actually went and measured those versus it. And it was so variable, very, very infrequent was it close to what was on the back of the packet. So the point that even if we knew what we were burning, we actually don't fully really know what we're putting back in either. And as well, from the point, like you said, the composition of what you are eating, sports nutrition, like you say, is probably the most accurate, because they know there's this amount of sugar that's been put into this, into this packet or in this drink. And there's nothing else, there's no fat, there's no fiber, and other things to go with it. Whereas as soon as we eat food on a plate, you've got fiber, you've got other things going on that are going to dictate some of that uptake, some of that digestion. And again, even if we knew how much we burnt, how much was in the food, we don't know what's happened once it's gone in the body either. So I knew that that question would open this discussion, but it is important for people to understand that, I think, and understand that it's not so linear in terms of what we do, and perhaps different approaches. So I've got a question actually off the back of that then to you. So this listener has asked that question and indicates that they weigh food, count calories, and we've just said, well, that doesn't really work. because we don't know what we're putting in. Now, it might coincidentally work for that person. Do we have what approach do we take that's different to that then if that doesn't work?
Well, eventually you can make it work, because like you will make the same error over and over again. So let's say that like you decide to use the values from Garmin, and then you estimate the rest of the day, whatever it is, and then over time you will figure out how much of an error there is, because you will be either gaining or losing weight or body mass. And then you can basically figure out like, oh, perhaps I need to adjust this number a bit. And this is what I actually do with athletes. So basically like I always use the same amount of efficiencies like on during exercise. For professionals, I'm happy to use 24%. For non-elites, I would actually use more like 22, 21%, because this is what actually we're seeing in the lab. And then for the rest of the day, you use like a resting metabolic rate, and then you multiply by like 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, which is because basically you're not just like lying in bed the whole day. And I would then change this factor based on like individual and the feedback I'm getting from that individual. So sometimes I would leave it at, 1.4 to 1. Sometimes I would go down to 1.2. And then just decide like and see what actually works for this person. And then once I know it's like, that's it, I will just keep on using the same equation for the whole season. And that usually like works. I never needed to change the way I calculate the things in a race then.
I was going to say, and am I right by saying that, also it's important to understand those changes when you intervene at the time, because the body will adapt to that over time as well. So whilst you might think something's not working, well, actually it might have worked in the first instance, but our body has got used to that intake at the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of guesswork. Like, it's really trial and error in the end of the day, because like even if you like really are careful in weighing the food, like being super precise with fat is so difficult. And like 1 gram of fat is like 9 kilocalories, and like every little single spoon can make a massive difference in the energy intake. So, and the body will like, first what will do is like when you increase the intake or decrease the intake, it will like automatically will also perhaps have more energy. You will go to do some other stuff around the house when you otherwise wouldn't do. So basically it will automatically like adjust the energy expenditure if you reduce or increase the amount of energy you're putting in. So like it just opens a can of worms, or whatever you say in the UK, and then just like you just don't want to know how much variation there is and how complex this question actually is, because then you're like, why am I even doing this?
Yeah. There are some great studies on that, and like you say, there's things about morning fasts and activity levels and calorie consumption, and it is so complex, like you say, that we can't just go off that, and in a way we have to feel it out, maybe use some guidance, yeah, for sure, but understand how that's affecting your body as well, and your training, of course, as well. If we're not getting enough, we're not going to train, we're not going to adapt as well either. Right. Next question. What I'm going to make the start of this up, but what source of energy during a 5-hour ride, or what is the source of energy during a 5-hour ride, zone 2, zone 3, if you intake only 200 kilocalories in liquid form, but you've burnt 4,000 kilocalories during the ride?
We are talking about the source of energy from endogenous or exogenous sources.
I'm gonna guess exogenous. So this is something that I come across, and some athletes that I've worked with as well. It is, I don't know if you experienced this, but the use of calories versus macros I think is somewhat important. Like, is that 200 kilocalories of carbohydrates, or is there some fat? Is it, but let's say for this question, we're talking about sports performance, sports endurance. We're going to say 200 kilocalories of exogenous carbohydrates to fuel that ride, in liquid form from a drink, let's say. But during the ride, we've burnt 4,000. What is the main fuel source during that ride?
Well, this is definitely not enough, having 50 grams of carbohydrates for 4,000 kilocalories, right? I've done it myself, and I didn't feel really good. I remember I was really proud of myself, and everyone around me was like, "Yeah, you're crazy." And I was like, no, this is like going to improve my adaptations to training, yes. But then I got home, and then I opened the fridge, and then I didn't stop eating, and probably didn't recover for a few days. So you don't want to do that. It's not worth it. We definitely eat more carbohydrates. Perhaps 50 grams an hour could potentially be kind of okay. And then if you do that, like, I would definitely go with liquids to basically like spread it out during an hour, rather than have like one gel every hour. Because usually in my experience, you kind of start craving over the last 15 minutes or so. So like either have something every half an hour, or have something like that you continuously take on board, like a liquid form. But in general, like what you would be using then as a source of energy to fuel you forwards, it's gonna be fat, it's going to be protein, and it's going to be obviously stored glycogen. But the problem is the protein, because you will start breaking down protein, and you don't want to do that. And the consequences are pretty long recovery.
Cool. So, next question, which is the final one on this sort of subject on calorie consumption. In fact, whether this last question is calorie consumption, I'm not sure. But this is a very good question around going into this period of, say, the season, the winter, in the Northern Hemisphere. But how do you manage your diet, or what's the best way to manage your diet and hydration during a short bout of sickness, for example, getting a cold or the flu?
I think the best way is to ask your mother, because they have usually some like old school recommendations on what to do. Well, or that, like my dad would tell you that you need to drink Jägermeister or some alcohol to basically disinfect the throat. And then the more I tell him that you don't pour down the alcohol down your throat, but actually it goes completely into a different like passage. So it doesn't work.
I mean, I've come across eating raw garlic as well for the antibacterial properties.
Well, it's everything. It's from eating a soup, herbal tea, I don't know what. Like, I'm really like, and it's the interesting thing is everything always works. All these strategies, because you always go through the flu, or any other like illness or like common cold or whatever. You will get better eventually, and then your experience of what you were taking will actually, this actually worked. Whereas it's perhaps not really that the case. But in like from the scientific perspective, what people are actually like recommending is zinc. There is some limited evidence that this could help. So that, and other than this, like I would encourage people to just like get the energy in if they're really struggling to get any energy in. Like if they lose all the appetite, I think it's important that they get energy in, because the body needs energy to basically defend itself. But otherwise, I would say like a varied diet with loads of fluids, and just normal diet. It's just like important you get the energy in, and like you try to make it as varied as possible. But other than this, I don't know. Like, do you have some suggestions?
I mean, I think you're right, and it depends on the individual as well, in a sense of, how they're feeling. Ultimately, they've got to get some energy, and depend on what they feel like eating is probably going to be close to the best thing, as long as we're trying to get a little bit of quality in. But you might just not feel like eating that. So, tea, honey, and lemon, again, there's a bit of sugar in there, some fluids. That is a common kind of cold alleviating drink. But there's probably not a lot behind it other than some sugar and water. But it's a little bit of, what do you really feel like? Some soup, because it's hot and it's easy to eat. And my perspective, like you say, ask your mum, because they make, soups and broths and things that make you feel good, and therefore you're going to eat more of it. You're going to get a bit more energy, and so then you can recover that little bit better throughout it. So, I wouldn't be any different on that, for sure. Right, moving on to recovery. So, a quick question on this one is some examples of good protein sources to refuel and repair after the ride.
Well, the protein. What you basically want after the training session is get all the essentials amino acids in as quickly as possible, probably, especially if the ride was long. What this means is that ideally you would have a source of protein with all those essential amino acids. And what is best? Well, there is no surprise, but to say whey protein is probably kind of the gold standard, but then milk-derived proteins, other milk-derived proteins like yogurts, protein puddings and stuff like that could be equally good, or just a little bit worse than a whey protein shake, or very soon after chicken and actually some meat or fish would equally be good. But kind of after the ride, for me, the most important is get the carbs in as quickly as possible. If you plan to have lunch or dinner or whatever more than an hour later, then yes, also have protein, and then a protein shake is a recovery shake makes a lot of sense. Or chocolate milk or something like that. It's really important to get all the carbs in as quickly as possible. And the more time it is until the next meal, the more important the protein is. So yeah, you don't need to experiment too much here. Whatever really works.
Cool. Right, I've got another great question. I'm quite excited about this one to see where it goes. But I'm going to move on to supplements now. But this one's a little bit more unique, this question. But so, what supplements? I'm paraphrasing some of this. What supplements should I consider in the preparation for the race across America?
Good one.
I like that question.
Well, there is only that many supplements we can actually talk about, we can't go super crazy. And for me, thinking about it, you're probably not obsessed about anaerobic kind of energy pathway. So creatine, probably not needed. Is it beta-alanine needed? Probably not. The only kind of supplement that comes to my mind, but there is so little evidence that I'm struggling to recommend, is L-carnitine. And you need to have a really high dose with a lot of carbohydrates to basically promote fat oxidation rates. But actually, again, the evidence is so weak that it's so difficult to say something. But this would be probably the
a lot of supplements are aimed at high intensity efforts. So it depends on what context we use supplement as. And my perception of the race across America is it's an ultra endurance, low intensity, long duration event. So really the things in that context, you could say carbohydrate supplement or protein supplement, but not an ergogenic age as such. I know that's a bit of, it's not black and white, but that's maybe where I would think about that type of thing. But like you say, beta alanine, creatine, high intensity, bicarb, high intensity. Probably don't see much in that context for such a long event, but perhaps, we worked with an athlete doing Badlands not so long ago, and that's, a pretty tough long ultra cycling event. And actually a lot of it comes down to is the logistics of what you're carrying, what you can carry, what you need at certain times. And that's where the supplementation, if you want to use that term, might come in of, well, actually, do I carry a bit of whey protein shake because I might not get dinner tonight, or I might need something at this time where the shops are shut, and therefore I can have it. At least I know I'm getting something that supports either recovery or that's only the way I perhaps see it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, race across America, they're like super well supported with the car, so they can always get whatever they want. But I think definitely you need to be ready for basically eating a lot during the training sessions, because then you will be eating on the bike pretty much all the meals. Definitely try out getting the protein, getting the carbohydrates in. Here, an important thing is yes, you need to be used to eating this type of carbohydrates, but you don't want to think about just 3 flavors. I think you need to go with as many flavors as possible already in training, so that when you come to the race, you're not oh, again, these gels that I've eaten 4 months ago in training. You need to be having I don't know, 10 manufacturers, get all the products you can get, and make sure that you have different sources of energy. So because the taste will just you will hate those products, and the more energy you can get still in, that most important it is, and the different taste will make it interesting. So I feel you need to be thinking from that perspective. And the other thing I was thinking about is perhaps you want to decrease the amount of caffeine you're having in your diet in the weeks before, so that kind of the effect of caffeine will actually be there when you need it, which is during the actual race. And let's call this dehabituation of caffeine would make sense. So actually reducing the amount of supplements you have, but it's just a crazy
we see that, and we see that in the likes of Ironman athletes, where you might be 10, certainly the amateur end, 10 to 16 hours, and you see that taste fatigue. And whenever I've discussed it with some people, it's a bit well, this is our strategy and this is what we want, but when we get say midway through the run, is this a point where we know we can deviate, or we know something that we might have practiced with that we can go to, because you're going to get pretty bored of that flavor by that time. And can you get some flat Coke or some Red Bull or some salted crackers at that time? That's okay. So yeah, the taste fatigue is very real, and I know people who have done kind of these big ultra events as well have been have a home comfort as well that you can call upon when times are quite hard, or times are they have this in the tour actually, some of the riders, where they might have something from home that they just crack out on, say, a rest day, and it might be a chocolate bar that just brings them some kind of happiness and something too. So I think it's such a large event like this. It's actually about just managing your body and your mind over, a performance change from a supplement that we know them as.
Yeah, agree.
Another interesting one coming up. So what supplement to take best for results in Hyrox brackets CrossFit style workouts? I would like to have strength, endurance and stamina all leveled up. So I think for the listeners, we discussed this before we started recording this, that Hyrox is very new, very similar to a CrossFit style competition. It involves a certain duration of running in between stations where you might do a sled pull, you might do some other strength or resistance based exercise. So we've got a real mixture of high intensity, a bit of endurance there, some resistive type exercises. What's your thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, any high intensity exercise will depend on carbohydrates, especially like if it's prolonged. And this is basically what it is. It's like an event where you basically go all out all the time, like interval after interval, basically like an interval training session, where like power to weight ratio doesn't apply. So it's basically pure power pretty much. So I think I would go with like definitely creatine. I would definitely go with beta alanine. I would go with, think about sodium bicarbonate even, because usually those like spaces are not well ventilated like the gyms. So the sweat rates will be really high. So even like sodium bicarbonate, if it doesn't cause GI issues, could help. And if you're used to it, I would definitely give it a try. And yeah, like during, it's just about getting the carbohydrates in and caffeine probably. Like pretty much like things will help here. That's for sure. Like it's going to be a lot of mental fatigue, a lot of peripheral fatigue, and anything can like basically help. I feel like the most important is this for sure, like making sure that carbohydrate intake is sufficient before and during. So make sure that you have the carbs in, but yeah, most of the supplements should also work here.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing, and I think CrossFit did kind of coin that at the start, and in this mixture of there is an endurance and a prolonged effort. It's not like doing a 1 rep max on the squat bar, but you do have to perform these explosive, high force, high power bouts in the middle of doing that. And like you've mentioned there, a lot of those supplements, creatine, beta alanine, sodium bicarb, guided towards that, although there's mixed evidence about some of the other things, but yeah, they're guided towards that high intensity bout and that recovery in between that as well. So it's fascinating, the physiology behind those types of events. It's not just a steady state, it's a real mix of things. And a final question of the day. Again, another interesting sport outside the world of cycling that's come up here. But the question is that many of the products seemed aimed at cyclists. Presumably, the nutritional benefits also apply to ultra endurance race walkers. And I think that the listener is referring to him or herself in that context.
Yeah, definitely. The reason why we always talk about cycling is because I'm obsessed with cycling, and I just see myself all the time. So it's actually like, yeah, all endurance sports would probably be very similar, and definitely race walking as well. Like Louise Burke, like was one of the alpha and omega of like sports nutrition. Like she has done a lot of work in ultra endurance or like race walkers, and I basically like showed that like the nutrition recommendations that are no different to like what for normal people or normal athletes would be, including that try the low carbohydrate diet didn't work. They tried many different approaches, and then always came back to the like normal high carbohydrate diet that was proven to be like the best, and that's pretty much it. Very simple answer.
She's done some amazing work in the sports nutrition field, but she did a lot of that within race walkers as well. And what we were talking about before as well is, I guess we consider a lot of this applies to endurance sport, like you said, and we think race walkers walking, that might not be so much on the spectrum, but actually in reality, some of those race walkers the energy demands are just as high because some walk faster than what most people run at, and they're scary fast at how fast they can walk, and there's going to be some energy output in that. So from that perspective, it's very much an endurance sport. It's not going out to walk your dog and needing a gel to do that. But yeah, race walking is classed as that. So I suppose the things that we talk about does gravitate towards cycling because that's quite popular. But equally, it's applicable to most endurance sports as well.
Yeah.
Well, we will. That's the end of our questions, and we really hope that there's some good takeaways from these conversations and some of those questions that have been asked for the listeners out there. We've enjoyed actually talking about some of these things that we perhaps wouldn't talk about normally. So that has also been exciting too. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back with you in the new year. We hope everyone has a great festive period and the holidays that will be happening around the release of this podcast, and we'll bring you some fresh new podcasts in the new year. So from myself and from Tim, we hope you have a great holiday and a great Christmas, and we'll see you soon.